The golden prison opens. She was dressed for a wedding, but was led into a sealed chamber instead. The women inside were not guests. They were witnesses. A court physician waited, not to help, but to record. That was the moment she understood this was not about marriage. It was about control. Fatma Sultan was 15 years old when the doors of the inner palace closed behind her and did not open again in the same way. Heavy silk rested on her shoulders. Her hair was arranged with care, and everyone around her spoke in calm, respectful voices. Yet the corridor she was taken through was not the one that led to celebration halls. It was narrower, quieter, and guarded. When the door finally opened, she did not see musicians or relatives. She saw a room prepared like a chamber of observation. Several women stood along the walls, not smiling, not speaking. A court physician waited near a small table, his eyes lowered, his hands already holding his tools and papers. No one explained anything. No one needed to. In that moment, Fatma understood that whatever this ceremony was, it had nothing to do with joy. Until that day, she had lived inside Topkapi Palace, believing that knowledge and discipline could protect her. She had grown up among books, gardens, and teachers who praised her memory and her sharp questions. She studied history, law, and astronomy, and sometimes she would stand by the windows at night and look at the sky, imagining a world that was wider than walls and rules. She knew the empire was powerful, but she also believed, in a quiet and innocent way, that being born into its ruling family meant being safe inside it. She did not yet understand that in this world, safety and freedom were not the same thing. The Ottoman Empire in 1623 ruled over lands across 3 continents, and Istanbul was its shining heart. The palace was not only a home for the Sultan, it was a living system where every person had a function. In its deepest and most guarded part lived the imperial harem, a hidden city of corridors, rooms, and silent rules. Hundreds of women lived there, their lives measured by protocol and opportunity. Some were captives taken from distant countries, some were servants, some rose to influence. The strange truth was that many of these women, who had arrived with nothing, had more possible futures than the daughters born into the royal family. From the moment Fatma was born, her future had already been decided in councils she would never see. A princess was not raised to choose. She was raised to be used. Royal daughters were not considered individuals in politics. They were considered guarantees, living promises given to powerful men to secure loyalty and prevent rebellion. When the time came, she would be married not because she wished it, but because the empire required it. Her life would serve stability, and her silence would serve order. The man chosen for her was Kara Mustafa Pasha, a commander almost 20 years older than her, respected, feared, and useful to the throne. For him, the marriage meant protection and advancement. For her, it meant the end of childhood. When the decision was announced, everyone spoke of honor and duty, but Fatma noticed how her mother, Qasim Sultan, avoided her eyes. That small detail stayed in her mind longer than all the speeches. 3 months before the wedding, the preparation began. It was called a sacred education, reserved only for princesses. The woman placed in charge of it was Goler Hatun, old, strict, and experienced in breaking habits and building obedience. On the first day, Fatma was taken to a chamber prepared especially for this training. It was beautiful in appearance, with fine carpets and dark polished walls, but nothing inside. It felt warm. She was told that from now on, nothing in her life would be accidental. Her days were divided into strict routines. She was taught how to walk with measured steps, how to stand, how to lower her eyes, and how to hold her hands. Even the angle of her head was corrected again and again. She had to learn many different forms of bowing, each one for a different situation, each one reminding her of her place. Mistakes were not treated as simple errors. They were treated as signs of disobedience, and they were corrected immediately and publicly. Soon, Even her words were taken from her. She was given a short list of approved phrases, all of them about gratitude, apology, and acceptance. Any other kind of speech brought punishment, sometimes isolation, sometimes humiliation in front of others. The girl who once loved long discussions began to think in silence, afraid of her own voice. At night, alone, she started to understand that this was not preparation for a marriage. It was preparation for becoming someone else. And she did not yet know that beneath the palace, in rooms hidden from light and sound, even darker lessons were already waiting for her. The sacred education of obedience. They did not try to hurt her body first. They tried to rewrite her mind. Every rule was meant to remove a piece of who she used to be. And the most dangerous lesson was learning to obey even when no one was watching. After the first sealed chamber, Fatma Sultan's life stopped feeling like time and started feeling like a schedule carved into stone. Every day began before sunrise and ended only when her body was too tired to think. Gulnar Khatun, the old head of the harem, watched her like a craftsman watches unfinished work. There was no anger in her voice and no cruelty in her eyes, only certainty. She did not speak of punishment or reward. She spoke only of correction, as if Fatma were not a person, but a form that needed to be reshaped. The training was no longer only about how to walk or how to bow. It became about how to exist. Fatma's posture was corrected dozens of times a day, her steps measured, her head angle adjusted with light pressure from a cold finger. She was taught that even standing still could be a mistake if it was done in the wrong way. At first she tried to remember how she used to move freely in the gardens, but soon she realized that memory itself had become a kind of enemy. Then came the rules of speech. Her language was reduced to a short list of approved words and phrases, all of them about gratitude, apology, and acceptance. She could no longer ask questions. She could no longer explain herself. When she forgot and spoke freely, she was not shouted at. She was simply taken away and left alone in a small, cold room where the light never changed. When she returned, she was expected to continue as if nothing had happened. The silence began to grow inside her, not only around her. Every few days, she was brought before a small tribunal of senior women. They did not ask her how she felt. They observed how fast she obeyed, how quickly she lowered her eyes, how calmly she accepted correction. Sometimes her mother, Koksum Sultan, sat among them. She never spoke to Fatma during these sessions. She only watched. That was somehow worse. Fatma understood then that this was not only a lesson for her, it was a test for everyone around her, a proof that even a mother must choose the empire over her child. The lessons went deeper. Fatma was forced to memorize long passages from old texts about duty, obedience, and sacrifice. These books spoke about the erasure of the self as if it were a holy achievement. She had to recite them aloud, again and again, until the words began to replace her own thoughts. Even prayer was turned into a tool. At fixed hours, she was made to repeat special prayers written not for comfort, but for discipline, prayers that slowly taught her that her future did not belong to her. Twice a week, the training took a more humiliating form. Fatma was ordered to serve some of her father's favored concubines. She washed their hands, arranged their clothes, and stood in silence while they spoke to her as if she were a servant. This was done in front of others. Gulnar Khatun explained calmly that this was necessary to remove the last traces of pride. Fatma's hands often shook during these tasks, and sometimes tears fell despite her efforts, but no one reacted. The palace had no use for her emotions. Slowly, something inside her began to change. She noticed that she started to correct herself before anyone else could. She lowered her eyes without being told. She chose the approved words without thinking. The most frightening moment came when she realized that she was beginning to do these things even when she was alone. The palace no longer needed to watch her all the time. It was teaching her to watch herself. One evening, after another long day of lessons, Fatma was being led back through a quieter part of the palace. She noticed a heavy door she had never seen open before, guarded by two silent attendants. From behind it came a strange smell, like wax and oil mixed with something cold and unfamiliar. Without thinking, she asked what was inside. The woman guiding her stopped for a moment, and then said quietly that those rooms were used for the next stage of preparation, a stage reserved only for princesses. That night, Fatma lay awake, staring at the ceiling. For the first time, she understood that everything so far had only been the surface of her education. Whatever waited behind that door was not meant to teach her how to behave. It was meant to finish teaching her who she was allowed to be, and she knew, with a deep and growing fear, that she would be taken there very soon. The chamber beneath the palace, they told her the next lessons were only exercises, but the stairs went down, not forward. What waited below was not meant to teach. It was meant to remove the last resistance. In those rooms, even fear was measured and written down. The morning they came for Fatma Sultan, no one explained where she was being taken. Two attendants walked beside her in silence, their steps slow and exact. They did not take her through the familiar corridors of the upper palace. Instead, they turned toward a narrow passage that led downward. The air changed as they descended, growing cooler and heavier, and the sounds of the palace slowly disappeared. By the time they reached the lower level, it felt as if the world she knew had been sealed far above her. The door they opened was thick and heavy. Inside was a room that looked like a perfect copy of a bridal chamber, with carpets, lamps, and a bed arranged with careful precision. But something was wrong. The room did not feel lived in. It felt prepared. Along the walls stood several women she did not recognize, and near a small table stood a court physician with papers and instruments. No one smiled. No one spoke to her. She realized then that this place was not meant for comfort. It was meant for observation. Gulnar Hatun explained in a calm voice that this was part of her final preparation. She said these were only rehearsals, only lessons, and that everything was for her own good and for the honor of the dynasty. Fatma listened, but her attention kept returning to the strange figures in the room. In one corner stood lifeless forms made of wax, shaped like human bodies with unsettling detail. They had been crafted to look real, down to the smallest features. Seeing them made her chest feel tight, as if the air itself had become heavier. The lessons began immediately. She was told where to stand, how to sit, how to lower her eyes, and how to wait. Instructors demonstrated movements and expected her to repeat them exactly. When she hesitated, they corrected her hands, her shoulders, her head. Every action was watched. The physician wrote things down without looking at her face. At first, she did not understand what he was recording, but soon she realized that it was not only her movements, it was her reactions. When her hands trembled, it was written down. When she looked away too quickly, it was written down. When her breathing became too fast, it was written down. Gulnar Hatun explained that these signs showed weakness, and weakness had to be removed. If Fatma showed too much fear, the lesson was repeated. If she began to cry, the lesson was repeated. Each repetition was longer than the last, and each one left her more exhausted. Days passed in this way, though she could no longer tell how many. She was taken to different underground rooms, all arranged like copies of the same chamber. In each one, the same routines waited for her, the same silent observers, the same writing hand of the physician. Slowly, she began to understand that these rooms were not meant to teach her what to do. They were meant to teach her what not to feel. Between sessions, she was kept in a small, quiet room with no windows. There, she tried to remember who she had been before this training, but the memories felt distant, like stories she had once read. She noticed that her body was beginning to move before her mind could decide. She began to follow instructions without thinking. That frightened her more than the rooms themselves. One day, during a session, She did not react at all. Her face stayed calm, her hands did not shake, and her breathing remained steady. A physician wrote for a long time. Golnar Hatun looked at her and nodded slightly. That small gesture filled Fatma with a cold understanding. The palace did not want her to survive these lessons. It wanted her to disappear inside them. That evening, as she was being led back, she heard voices from a deeper corridor, one she had never been taken down before. The door at the end of it was larger and more heavily guarded than the others. She asked, very quietly, what was behind it. The attendant did not answer. She only said that some rooms were not for practice. At night, Fatma did not sleep, because she knew that everything so far had still been called preparation. And if this was only preparation, she could not imagine what the palace considered the real beginning. Talam and jerk. They said this was only practice, but nothing here felt unreal. The rooms were copies, the bodies were wax, and the witnesses were silent. Here even fear was counted, and every tear became a reason to repeat the lesson. The next stage of Fatma Sultan's preparation did not happen in the light of the palace. She was taken down again, deeper than before, into corridors where the air felt cold and still. The rooms there were known by a name spoken quietly, Talim and Jerk, a phrase that meant training and discipline. Golnar Hatun said this was the most important part of her education, the part that would make sure there were no mistakes later. When the heavy door opened, Fatma saw another chamber arranged like a perfect bridal room, with carpets, lamps, and a bed placed exactly as it would be on the real night. But the silence in the room felt wrong, and the smell of wax and oil made her stomach tighten. In one corner stood figures shaped like people, made of wax with frightening detail. Their faces were smooth and empty, but their bodies were made to look real in every other way. Fatma had seen nothing like them before. Around the room stood several women, and as always, the court physician with his papers. No one spoke to her with kindness. Golnar Hatun explained that these sessions were meant to remove uncertainty. Fatma was told where to stand, how to sit, how to lower her eyes, and how to move. Instructors demonstrated, then expected her to repeat everything exactly. At first, her hands shook. She tried to follow the instructions, but her body did not want to obey. Each time she hesitated, someone corrected her posture, her shoulders, her head. The physician wrote continuously without looking up. Fatma realized that he was not only recording what she did, but how she reacted. When her breathing became fast, it was written down. When her eyes filled with tears, it was written down. Golnar Hatun said calmly that these were signs of weakness, and weakness required more training. So the lessons were repeated. If Fatma cried, the session started again. If her voice trembled, the session started again. If she froze, the session started again. Each repetition was longer and more exhausting than the last. She began to understand that there was no way to succeed here except to stop reacting. The room was not trying to teach her what to do. It was trying to teach her what not to feel. She was taken to different underground rooms, each one arranged in the same way, each one watched by the same silent observers. The wax figures were always there. The physician was always there. The writing never stopped. Between sessions, she was kept in a small, empty room with no windows. Sometimes she could not tell if hours or days were passing. Her body ached, but the worst pain was inside her head, where thoughts began to slow and become quiet. One day, during a session, she did not cry. Her face stayed still. Her hands did not shake. She followed every instruction without hesitation. The physician wrote for a long time. Golnar Hatun watched her carefully and then nodded. That small movement made Fatma feel colder than any punishment. She understood what it meant. The palace was not trying to make her stronger. It was trying to make her empty. After that, the sessions changed. They became more detailed and more strict. Every movement had to be exact. Every pause had to be timed. If she made even a small mistake, everything began again from the start. Fatma noticed that she no longer needed to be told to correct herself. She began to do it automatically. The palace had started to live inside her. Sometimes, as she was led back through the corridors, she heard sounds from even deeper rooms. The doors there were larger, and the guards did not look at her. Once she asked what happened in those rooms. The attendant only said that those were not for practice. That night, lying alone in her small room, Fatma understood that talim and jerk were not meant to prepare her for the wedding. They were meant to make sure she would not be able to resist it. And for the first time, she realized with terrible clarity that the real night had not even begun yet. The night with witnesses, the doors did not close for privacy. They closed for control. She was not alone, and she was never meant to be. This was not a wedding night. It was an examination. The day of the wedding arrived with music, incense, and celebration that Fatma Sultan could hear but not touch. From early morning, the palace above her moved like a living festival. Servants hurried through corridors. Musicians practiced, and distant cheers rose and fell like waves. In her room, everything was quiet and carefully arranged. She was washed, dressed, and prepared without being asked a single question. Her body moved the way it had been trained to move. Her hands did not shake. Her face did not show what she felt. The palace had done its work well. She was led through corridors she had never walked before, deeper into the inner parts of the palace. When the doors of the chamber opened, she knew immediately that this was not a place for two people. Several women stood along the walls, silent and still. Gulnar Hatton was there. The court physician was there, holding his papers as always. No one smiled. No one tried to comfort her. This was not a room for emotion. It was a room for record. The chamber itself was beautiful, arranged like a perfect bridal room, with lamps, fine fabrics, and careful decorations. But the air felt heavy, as if the walls themselves were waiting. Fatma was guided to the center and told where to stand, how to lower her eyes, how to breathe. The instructions were given in the same calm voice she had heard for months. Nothing in this moment was new. That was the most frightening part. She understood then what talim and jerk had truly been for. Every movement she made now came from memory drilled into her body. She did not need to think. She only needed to follow the pattern. The women around the room watched closely. The physician wrote. Even her smallest reactions were being measured. She realized that this night was not private and had never been meant to be. It was the final test of her obedience. When Kara Mustafa Pasha arrived, the room did not change its mood. He was greeted with respect and formality, but there was no warmth. For him, this was also part of the system, though a far kinder one. He had gained what he came for, a direct tie to the dynasty. Fatma did not look at his face. She had been taught not to. Her world had become a series of instructions and pauses. Everything that followed happened the way it had been rehearsed, the way it had been forced into her through endless repetition. When her body reacted with fear, she pushed it down. When her mind tried to escape, she pulled it back. The physician's pen kept moving. Gulnar Hatton watched without expression. The witnesses did not speak. The silence in the room felt heavier than any sound. At one moment, Fatma felt tears rise, and for a second she almost failed. She remembered the cold rooms, the repeated sessions, the words written down every time she showed weakness. Her body corrected itself before anyone else could. The tears did not fall. The palace had finally achieved what it wanted. When it was over, there was no comfort, no kind word, no sign that this had been something personal or meaningful. The physician closed his papers. The women began to leave. The room emptied in an orderly way, as if a task had been completed. Fatma remained where she was told to remain, her thoughts slow and distant, her body still following rules even when no one was speaking. Later, she was taken away to another room to rest, though rest was not the right word for what followed. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, feeling as if something inside her had been sealed forever. She understood now that the empire did not only want her obedience for one night, it wanted it for the rest of her life. Before dawn, she heard the sound of doors opening and closing somewhere far away in the palace. For the first time, she wondered what would happen if one day she failed, if one day she could not remain silent or calm or perfect. And in that quiet moment, she realized something even more terrifying. This night had not been the end of her sentence. It had only been the beginning. The price of royal blood years later, she would realize the palace did not ruin her life. It redesigned it. What happened to her was not a secret. It was a method. And methods do not die with one victim. They wait for the next. After the wedding, Fatma Sultan's life moved into a quieter, colder shape. From the outside, everything looked successful. She lived in a large house, servants answered her, and her name was spoken with respect. But inside, she felt as if she were still standing in those underground rooms. She woke at the same hours, sat the way she had been taught to sit, and spoke only when necessary. Even when no one was watching, her body behaved as if it still was. The palace had followed her without following her. Her husband was not cruel in obvious ways, but he was never meant to be gentle. Their marriage was not built on understanding. It was built on agreement between powerful men. Fatma did her duties, smiled when expected, and kept her thoughts hidden. Sometimes, in the quiet of the night, she would remember the girl who once looked at the stars and felt a strange distance, as if that girl had lived in another lifetime. What hurt most was not what had been done to her, but how normal it had been made to feel. No one around her spoke of those months of preparation. No one spoke of the witnesses or the physician or the records. It was as if that part of her life had been sealed behind a door that even memory was not supposed to open. Years passed, and slowly small pieces of truth began to reach her. In quiet conversations and careful hints, she heard about other princesses. Different names, different faces, the same preparation. The same silent training. The same sealed rooms. She realized then that her story was not unique. It was a pattern. The Ottoman system did not trust its own blood. It managed it. Princesses were not raised to become powerful. They were raised to become predictable. Every royal marriage was a political tool, and every royal daughter was shaped to make sure she would never become a danger to that plan. Talon and Jerk, the tribunals, the witness nights, none of it existed for tradition or honor. It existed for control. Much later, Fatma learned something even more disturbing. The court physicians did not write their notes for health. They wrote them for the palace. Reactions, fear, resistance, obedience, everything was recorded and stored. These were not memories. They were instructions. Each generation studied the failures and improved the method. The system did not just break girls. It learned how to break them better. The most painful understanding came when she finally saw her mother's place in all of this. Kashum Sultan had once been shaped by the same machine. She had survived it, mastered it, and risen because of it. To protect her power, she had also protected the system. Fatma realized that in the palace, even love had limits, and those limits were drawn by the needs of the empire. Fatma lived many years. She had children. She played her role in the great silent theater of power. To history, she would look like a successful alliance, a proper imperial wife. But inside, she knew that something essential had been taken from her long before she ever left the palace. The training had not prepared her for marriage. It had prepared her for disappearance. When the empire began to weaken and centuries later, its palaces turned into museums, some of the old records remained hidden in archives. Fragments, coded notes, references to procedures that did not belong in stories of glory. Historians would one day find them and realize that behind the gold and ceremony there had been a cold, careful system that treated its own daughters as instruments. Empires are often remembered for their wars, their buildings, and their laws. They are rarely remembered for what they did to their own children. Fatma Sultan's life stands as a quiet answer to that silence. Because some of the darkest things in human history are not done in anger or chaos. They are done calmly, slowly, and with complete confidence that they are necessary. And that is what makes them truly terrifying.